oh yeah, this is a normal thing. 3 candidates always resign just before the biggest primary weekend in a totally non-coordinated way. Like, it's just unbelievable.
And all give their support for one candidate.
Just so cynical. So, there's no pretense there. There's no pretense whatsoever. It was just like, hey, this guy's getting too close.
Welcome back to I'm the Villain. Today, we're going to be talking about radicalization, which is a topic that I think is very much on people's minds right now, especially for me personally. After Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I am very much on the radicalization train. So today we're talking with Rowan Emslie, who is talking to us from Brussels, actually. So I think this is going to be really interesting to get this, have this conversation from, the perspective of somebody who's actually like kind of outside of the U.S., because I've been thinking about this from a very U.S.-centric perspective. But Rowan, why don't you just go ahead and give us, the listeners, a few sentences, whatever you think they should know about you.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. So I'm Rowan. I'm originally from the UK, but I have been a sort of... as some colleagues say it jokingly, a political refugee here in mainland Europe for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm a digital communications expert for my sort of day job, but I also run a podcast called Connected and Disaffected, which is all about sort of millennials and their integration into politics and all the reasons why they spend a lot of time doom scrolling online and feeling black-pilled about everything, and maybe some ways that we can move that conversation forwards, which is not always easy in the last few years, as I'm sure you're aware. But that's kind of that's what we try to do.
I think it's funny that you're owning radicalization for yourself, because I feel like in our generation, we're like kind of using that as a weapon for the other side, right?
Yeah.
Like everyone on the other side, like they're radicalized, but we're just like fighting for human rights, or like the other side thinks like those lefties are radicalized and like trying to take away everyone's rights. But I enjoy you reclaiming the term.
Well, I think there's a slightly strange narrative around this, right? So there's obviously been the growth of the rebirth rather of socialism, democratic socialism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, in many countries, but notably the US and the UK in the last 5 years or so. And because both in the UK and the US, the leadership have been like old 70s socialists, right? It's Jeremy Corbyn, who's like the most, traditional, like in the UK press, he was just mocked for being so like cartoonishly a 70s socialist. And then you have, Bernie Sanders, obviously in the US. But I think because it's like these old dudes who've kind of come back from what was very unpopular politics for 40 years or so, I think there's this sense that it's like, oh, all these young people are being led astray, by these radicalizing older influences. And how can we stop this, and get them back on the correct path? But the more I've kind of thought about this, the more we've talked about all the sort of extant problems in politics, the more I think, well, I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to be radicalized if you're, under 40 or even under 50. Like, there's a lot of good reasons, a good material analysis of your circumstance and the world, to be dissatisfied with the status quo. I think it's an odd thing to say, well, we solved it. We did neoliberalism. End of history and all that good stuff, and it's working out great. Where is that coming from? I don't get it, because often what we heard when Corbyn first came around was, hey, we tried socialism and it didn't work. And it's like, I always feel like saying, well, yeah, now we've tried the other thing and that's also not working. So like,
so we got to do something.
Yeah, there's got to be another choice here, So,
Right.
yeah.
And it's also not even necessarily this like, okay, this like rejection of like, okay, this never worked. Like, I think you could very well see it as like, okay, capitalism was like this necessary part of this progression. And like, you know, at the time that was like the most kind of social justice oriented system around. But we can like, you know, accept that and then like, be like, okay, but we have to, you know, we are now in this like late capitalism phase
Right.
where we're trying to be like, okay, now that we have done that and it has had some benefits for, you know, people around the world, okay, how can we get to the next level?
Yeah, rather
Right?
than just being like, no, this is it. This is as
Oh,
good.
this sucks,
is as
right?
good as
Yeah.
it gets. You know.
Yeah.
It's it's that joke tweet, right? I just got back from the centrist rally, so inspiring. Crowd of people chanting, "We can never have anything better."
And there's something. There feels like there's some kind of mechanism that, you know, maybe it's global, certainly within the U.S., that really kind of prevents the iteration that feels necessary to be able to make changes to our economic system in a way that is responsive to the needs of people. But that feels like not a big ask for me. Like like it feels like it should be a reasonable ask to be like, okay, so we have things that we know are good. Can we respond to the things that we think are bad? But maybe in doing so, it would involve, you know, people in power giving up some power. But maybe we can go into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that is typically the big barrier, I would say. Yeah, I mean I'm from London, as I said. I've finished high school in 2008, right at the peak of the, you know, global economic crisis, which you know, for US listeners, London is the, you know, one of the economic hubs of the world in terms of banking and finance, right? In the UK, the economy is largely made up of the service sector, and a huge chunk of that is finance. So it's really like our entire economy post the 1970s, post the, you know, Thatcher and the birth of neoliberalism was really based on, well, how much can we juice up this financial sector? So the collapse of that should have been a serious impact, a serious threat on, okay, well, where are we going as a country? And I remember going to, you know, Occupy, not Wall Street, obviously, but Occupy London, and seeing all of this, these new thinkers that have been kind of dismissed. You know, David Graeber was based at LSE at the time, who came up with the phrase "We are the 99%." He recently died. And there's all this energy around that, and this realization that everything that had gone wrong was the thing that we'd bet on as a country, right? And then there were no repercussions for that at all. And then I went to university, and all of the economics classes I had, all of the politics classes I had were just like, yep, this is, you know, it used to be that there are two competing economic ideologies, and then we settled on this one, and it was the best one. And neoliberalism is like the best version of that. And there was no like, oh, maybe we should reconsider any aspect of this. It was just like orthodoxy. And it felt insane. You know, it felt like we were living in this crazy world. So that was kind of the start, I think, the start of the journey for a lot of people. That's almost like that's the big bang, I think, for millennials, is the 2008 crisis. And I know, like, obviously in the States as well, because in a much more real way, is based on people's houses and like where they lived, whereas ours was just like betting on that housing market, you know, which is an even more sort of grotesque and vulture-like kind of activity. But I can also imagine that this is this big moment in the US for people to start being kind of radicalized, say, hey, we need to rethink where we're going.
Yeah. And when you say there were no repercussions, do you mean for like the banking companies in London?
Yeah, I mean,
like
nothing changed.
to the job market,
Absolutely
yeah.
nothing changed. No, you know, no banker went to jail, right? Like the one of the guys who went to jail was a whistleblower. And it's just like,
Right.
cool, okay, what are we doing here? Like, how many people out of work? How much money lost? The huge spending from taxpayers. This is an enormous disaster, and we know who did it, and yet nothing happened. Nothing changed.
Right.
And now we're just right back to it. We're just right back to it, and it, like 6 months, I think, or maybe 9 months, that house prices in London went down. And then 9 months later, everyone's still unemployed, but the house prices keep going up. It's just like, okay, we're just going to pretend this didn't happen.
Yeah. My mom is a lawyer, and she worked very briefly for Barclays right after they had the LIBOR scandal, which is basically, for those who don't know, like Barclays was this, big bank in London that was kind of doing this fixing of the interest rates, right? And they found out that had happened, and it just was like this huge kind of like scandal, basically. And afterwards they were doing these like ethics, reorientation trainings for people, and it was just like such a joke.
Yeah, people have to do
right?
like a half-day workshop or whatever on like having morals.
Yeah, like don't predatorily lend to people. Like, what is that? What is that?
Yeah. Crazy. Like, there's no other place where that works. But I mean, this is the problem with the sort of system of going, well, we bet everything on the service economy, and this is the biggest single chunk of the service economy. So like, there's no turning this car around,
Right.
So that was I have like four things I think that people should be radicalized about, but I think that was the first one, is these like economic crises. Because we had 2008, and then there was the Euro crisis a little bit later on in Europe. And then obviously now we're having the COVID-related crisis. So that's three apparently generational crises in the first 15 years of my, adult life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things that should, indicate to the average human, much like certainly a millennial, but to the average human, that the economy does not give a single fuck about you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's the definition of insanity, right? Like, okay, we're just going to keep doing this. Cool.
And that the government will kind of let it crash and then pour a lot of like money back into it, but you will probably get none of that money. Yeah. So that's one, right? So just ongoing economic instabilities, which should make any voter go, hey, we are not managing the economy properly. I mean, we keep having these same issues over and over. Like, this isn't the stable growth based system that we were led to believe, And then if you go, you can go deeper and deeper into that, there's different models. Anyone that's not in like the top 10% should feel that way.
Sure. And even then, actually, the top 10% is like, they're so much poorer than the top 0.1%. It's like an unbelievable stratification. So that's a whole area, and that is basically our adult lives has lived in the shadow of a crisis or the recovery from a crisis, which have never really occurred. Like, we never got back to where we were. And then the next one is related to that, which is the just elite failure. So from government to business, the armed forces, like there are so many examples that we have in the last, again, 15 years of the leaders who are meant to solve these problems failing to solve the problems or being part of the problem, right?
Yeah, there was a news piece that came out recently that said that part of the Congress passed the CARES Act, which is like this $2 trillion relief for COVID, and a significant portion of that went to the military, and instead of spending that on medical supplies like they said they would, they spend it on like jets.
Yeah. I mean, I just saw an article in Foreign Policy about how the U.S. Navy wants to have a 400 ship navy, and it's like, what is going on, right? Like in this context of global lockdown, probably going to be 2 million people dying from this disease. It's like, well, what we need is more ways to do war.
Right.
It seems insane to me. But there's so many of these, right in a row. Like when I was a teenager, it was, Afghanistan, Iraq, right, which just were extremely unpopular at the time. Like in Britain, it was the biggest ever protest was against the Iraq War.
Right.
And then they went ahead, and it turned into the debacle that everybody thought that was going to turn into. It was like, well, we don't have a plan. Like, how do we leave? What does success look like? You know, I'm a consultant. Like, I would say to them, like, what if we were to do this successfully? What would that look like? And like, that was never a part of the plan, right? So that became this huge issue. You know, and it's another great generational divide, right? Where my parents' generation would talk about like Vietnam, for example, and it's like, well, Afghanistan's been going on way longer than Vietnam. You know, this is just put it into context. Like, this is so many years. Like, it's still happening. There's still people in the next generation down are now going to be going and getting deployed to Afghanistan. Like, it's insane, right? So there's that. And then there's 2008, no repercussions. And then you have the great hope, the great joy for everybody was Obama, right? Like, he's the single rallying kind of like leader of, certainly in the US and the UK. We've had terrible prime ministers in the last, no one's really gotten that excited about any of them, but Obama coming in, he was the big hope, right? And he made all these promises, but then it all just fell into this kind of managerial limbo where a lot of the things that you wanted to happen didn't happen, or they happened, but in a less interesting way than maybe they should have happened. You know, it didn't live up to it. And that's very disheartening and disappointing, I think, for a lot of people, and particularly for, you know, millennials. That's the first person they voted for, probably, you know.
Right.
And so that's a huge disappointment, right? And then you have the rise of populists and you know, lunatics, right, who are now running the show. And all of the corruption and all of the chaos that comes with that, you know, both sides of the Atlantic, and also all over Europe as well. I mean, this is not, obviously Trump is like the loudest one of these people, but there are plenty of these people, right? So, and then you mentioned it earlier, COVID and all of the insane responses and terrible mismanagement. In the UK, we're seeing tons and tons of corruption around government, you know, government purchases, right? Going to this small group of people who keep failing, like, you know, $50 million for an app that never gets released on the testing and tracing. And then that same company gets the next contract to do that thing. It's just like, you know, you hear politicians talk a lot about trust, and they're like, we need more trust in, you know, in politics and in our leaders. And it's really the other way around. Is we haven't seen anything trustworthy. You know, we've had a lot of disappointments from our leaders in the last 15 years or so. So there's another thing where you go, well, we can't rely on the people at the top, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, we need to shake up the system, right? This is another radicalizing lever, I think, and I don't know if it's talked about enough how disappointing the leadership has been for a long time. Even the best one, right, ended up being disappointing.
Yeah. Even the one that like garnered all the hope and all the support, and the thing, you know, people were like kind of really hanging their hat on.
Yeah.
Did an only okay job at like strengthening the safety net for people.
Right.
Yeah.
And even now, as we're going, you know, for us, you know, election day is like, you know, in like 37 days or something.
Yeah.
You know, no one is excited about like Joe Biden, right? You know, it's just more of the same, right? And so,
and it's like we systematically like throughout the process of the election weeded out the people that we found most exciting.
Well, yeah, and in a pretty sinister way, actually, in particular in this primary season, where it was like, oh yeah, this is a normal thing. 3 candidates always resign just before the biggest primary weekend in a totally non-coordinated way. Like, it's just unbelievable.
And all give their support for one candidate.
Just so cynical. So, you know, there's no pretense there. There's no pretense whatsoever. It was just like, hey, this guy's getting too close. You know, the radical change candidate is getting too close. We don't have primaries in the UK, or anywhere else, actually. Doesn't have primaries. But we had a somewhat similar thing with Corbyn, where when he first came in, he'd been on every leadership ballot for the Labour Party for like 20 years or something, because the left wing of the party had always been like, okay, yeah, we need to put somebody up. And then he never got past the first round. He was nowhere near, right? Labour Party similar to the Democrats in that it's gone a lot more, a lot further to the right since the 80s, right? So he was kind of like, yeah, nice, we'll have, the lefty Jeremy Corbyn on here. And it was a total surprise when he won. And basically he won because loads of people, mostly young people, joined the Labour Party. And in the Labour Party, the members can also vote for the leaders. So, which you can't do. Like the other party in the UK doesn't have that same system. It's all just party by party. And so it freaked everybody out, basically. They thought it would never happen. And so the commentating class, the columnists, the media and all that stuff, they were like, oh, well, this is ridiculous. Labour have shot themselves in the foot. He's completely unelectable. They just said that from the start, even though he'd gotten like 400,000 people to join a political party, which if you look at political parties in the US, the UK, Germany, France, they've been declining in membership since the 60s. This is an unprecedented reversal. So it's like, okay, well, there's something there. But they were just like, nah, dismiss this. No one will ever vote for him. And then he ended up doing pretty well at the next election on a pretty radical manifesto, which was very much like, we need to, make things have a lot more public ownership. We need to be a lot more generous, tax people more, just like very old school politics, right? Which, again, in the run up to the election, all the commentators are like, well, these aren't popular. This is completely unpopular. Even though if you poll on those particular issues, this is like healthcare in the US.
Super popular.
It's really popular. If you actually ask people on the issue is popular. But then if you go, well, if this guy brings in this issue, how do you feel about that? And they go, no, I hate that guy. He's terrible. He's a bad guy. We had this kind of similar thing. And he did really, really well, almost got the win. And then the whole apparatus of power just turned on him. And it was like coordinated attack after coordinated attack. And it was that was our version of that, the primary, plan. But it was so clear that this was like, okay, we can't let this guy come anywhere near, We'll do anything we can. We'll smear him. We'll we'll say anything we can about him to get him out. Which is also, that's pretty radicalizing, I would say. When you see this kind of cynical use of power, it really in an attempt to disenfranchise people, to push new voters and new energy out of the political system, you go, what? Hang on. What is this for? Like, what are we doing? What is this whole circus about if it's not about arguing about ideas and policies and the way that the country should be? What's really going on here? And I think that's very disaffecting for a lot of people, I think,
Yeah. I think that a lot of people had that moment in 2016 when Bernie got fucked by the DNC.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it to me it was so shocking and kind of unprecedented because like it was confirmed, yes, there was a coordinated effort to make sure that Bernie did not get the nomination. And somehow in for this round of primaries it felt less shadowy, it was like, okay, at least they're doing it in front of everybody, like we can all see what's happening here. But still, I feel like I've met a lot of people that were like, oh yeah, I became disaffected or I became disinterested in the DNC and whatever, and even participating in the system because it became so clear how rigged it was in 2016.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But the thing that I think we're dealing with now is that that's exactly that disaffectedness and like not feeling like, you know, our vote has any meaning is exactly what gives those exact people more power.
Yeah, it's actually very beneficial to the
right. They want you to think that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is why I think we should own the being radicalized thing, because it's like, well, this should spur you into seeking alternatives, right? Which has happened, right? Like the DSA didn't exist in anybody's minds, you know, outside of a few radical organizers, probably in big cities, right? Like the DSA, no one was talking about the DSA in U.S. national politics, even under Obama, right?
Right.
And now it's this huge player, plenty of Congress people attached to them. Like that's a big change, and all of that energy is definitely, you know, Bernie related, right? So I think that's kind of the message, right? Is to take all these things that are completely dissatisfying and that should be radicalizing you and turn that into, well, let's seek alternatives here.
Yeah. I think I wanted to take a step back and define radicalization for listeners, like talk about what we think that means.
Yeah.
Do we think that means just being so fed up with the system that you're inspired to like act and do something about it?
So for me, it's about rejecting the choices that are given to you in the political system. And the US and the UK are similar in this way, in that your choices are limited. You know, there's two parties essentially that have any capability of winning, and even within those parties, right, normally they run unopposed, right? So even you can't like choose within the party often. And it's that thing of like, well, you know, you got to support your side because we're the good side or whatever, you know, or we're the one, you know, you're landlords and we're for landlords, you know, whatever it is, it's very limiting, and it puts you in this little box. And I think the process of radicalization is saying we reject those boxes. We reject the options available, and we would like to do something else.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that... How do you think that interplays with, at least in a U.S. context, and it seems like maybe in a UK context, of like, there's always the narrative of people being like, we can't afford to try and think outside of the box right now because we have to get so-and-so out of power.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like they don't have to be mutually exclusive for me personally, but I'd love to get your take on that.
So I think, I think this is one of the things I have heard my whole voting life, which is, well, yeah, okay, this guy isn't the best candidate, but, you know, he appeals to the people that, you know, wouldn't vote for our other people, right? Just give them something. Let's go for somebody, the safe option, the easy option, because then we're going to win. And the problem with that, if you're a progressive person, is that first of all, you end up supporting people who actually don't support the policy positions that you support. And then second of all, it basically hasn't worked since the 90s. In the UK, it hasn't worked since Tony Blair. And well, I mean, in the US, certainly 2008, right? Like Obama, that's the ideal situation where it's like, okay, he brought enough people from across the aisle whilst enlarging his own base, right, for that to be a thing, and then actually to be effective. And you know, all the great stuff that he did is essentially that first term, right? Mm-hmm. Then the second term, stasis had broken in, and the uniquely kind of paralyzed way that you guys do legislation had limited his options to actually achieve anything. So that's one of the problems, is that I feel like it doesn't matter how far to the right we shift, it's never enough. It's never going to be enough for the people on the other side. They'll just say, you know, they're calling Obama a communist, right? Like, I mean, it's just, it has no meaning anymore. Even when he's saying, oh, I only want to do bipartisan stuff. I only want to work with sensible Republicans. Me and John McCain were best friends. You know, he's doing everything he possibly can, and it's not enough, not even close, right? And it's no accident that the guy who inherited, the Republican Party was the guy who was the most extreme in his reaction to Obama, right? Like all it does is push everything further to the right. So you just get further and further away from the actual policies that we need to improve, the economics, right? Like these are big systemic things. I mean, that actually number 3 is debt, work, and housing, right? Big systemic things that have to be changed at a massive policy level. And you don't do that by just being like, okay, hey, we'll move a little bit to the right and we'll bring on some of these guys and we'll be like, you can be racist like once a week or whatever, just like that silly, like, oh, we'll just feed you like a little bit of racism is fine. And then, we can still get some stuff done. I don't think the means justify the ends is basically my issue with that.
Mm-hmm. Right. But then we move more and more towards the system of like kind of pendulum politics where as soon as the progressives get like even a minor win, then there's this backlash effect. And it's sort of like, is there a way in like the foreseeable future to get out of that system of this like pendulum, Because if anytime you try to do any of this concession politics, it just doesn't work, right?
I think the concession politics is worse. It leads to a more and more radical, because what the right understands electorally and have done for 30 years or so is you have to vilify your opponents, you have to create animosity and fear, and you have to push the window of what is acceptable towards whatever your ideology is. The NRA is a great example of this, right? When they were formed in the 70s, their reading of the right to bear arms was completely non-mainstream. Nobody had that opinion. No legal scholars, no judges, certainly. They were seen as insane cranks. But what they did is just endlessly push the conversation in that direction as much as possible until the center of gravity is near enough to that position that it becomes reasonable. And so actually, if you have, now healthcare for all is a common policy. It wasn't the policy of every Democratic candidate, but it's a policy of multiple Democratic candidates, and even the centrist ones are like, well, we're going to have something along those lines, which is unthinkable under, John Kerry, right? Unthinkable. No one would ever have spoken about it. Same in the UK. I mean, actually, it's been a weird thing. Since Corbyn lost, the Conservative Party have been passing a lot of the policies from the Labour manifesto because they're really popular policies where they're like, oh, maybe we should be nationalizing certain industries. Maybe we should be giving free internet to everybody. They just, because they're like, well, just take the win. These are popular. But that actually means that the policy window has shifted. So
right.
So when you're just going, oh yeah, here we'll shift over to accommodate you, you actually it becomes more and more extreme in one direction, and the reaction is completely unhinged anyway. I'm sure you could do a supercut of all the insane things that people said on Fox News about Obama, like completely unhinged.
Yeah, unhinged.
And it was the most moderate possible guy, the most conciliatory possible leader that you could have had. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. So the reaction is always going to be there. The pendulum is always going to be there because that serves a political purpose, So you just have to ignore it, I think.
Yeah, because I think right now in the U.S., that's exactly what's happening with the whole abolish the police and, you know, defund the police, is that, like, you know, they're trying to shift that Overton window of, like, you know, the political possibilities more towards, you know, the likelihood of, like, okay, let's say this really extreme thing to make the actual thing that we want seem more likely to happen.
Yeah, it's like negotiating, right?
Yeah.
For a price. You
Does
don't ever start with the thing that you actually want. You start with something way less than what you know, than what you actually want, and then you get negotiated upwards, and you're like, oh, good, I got the thing that I wanted. But
right.
The right has played that game for 30, 40 years. It's just that the left hasn't done it. And that's why they keep losing, right? And even on even when you win power, you still lose on policy often, you know.
Right.
That's Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, right? They're the great examples of this, right? Like, they're the people who passed, in a way, you know, Clinton and the crime bill, right? Like, this is the big bête noire of the Black Lives Matter protests, and that's not a Republican bill, that's a Democrat bill.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So what are we doing here? You know, like, what are we ascribing things to? Yeah.
But it is the only way to make policy change that lasts, to, like, try and smash it through when your party has enough power in, you know, the American political system, and then hope that people feel good effects from it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes commonplace. Like, is that the only way to make lasting change?
I mean, it's definitely not the only way, and I don't want to be completely electoralist here.
Yeah.
In that, you know,
it's not a very radical way of thinking.
Well, and also just to say to people, every 4 years you get your one chance, you know, is pretty. I mean, if you're talking about ways to get people to disengage with politics, I mean, that's a pretty good way to do it, right? To say, well, this is it. This is your one chance. If it doesn't go your way, then just, you know,
you're fucked.
You're screwed. Like,
yeah,
it's pretty disenchanting. So I don't want to push totally on that. Also, I mean, frankly, the U.S. Legislative system is fundamentally broken. I mean, it's nuts. Like, you barely pass laws. I mean, none at all, right? I mean, how many bills has Congress pushed to Senate, and like what is passed? Has anything been passed under Trump? Like 2 laws or something? You know, even he with his, like, radical agenda or whatever couldn't get anything passed because it's completely a broken. So that top level is very broken. I think in the US that there is a lot to be said for particularly city level legislating and the rise of, you know, like super mayors and all that kind of stuff. Because cities are where most people are. It's where many of the problems can be solved. You know, if you talk about, you know, housing and work and actually climate, you know, like, these are problems that are concentrated in places where people live. So the people who have political power over those people are also very important. So that kind of, like, city level stuff, I think, is very important. But then also we have seen in the last 10 years, particularly, massive social movements that have been incredibly impactful. You know, the movement from the school shooters, right? That has been incredibly impactful. Black Lives Matter, we've already spoken about. Also, you know, Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg movement, Extinction Rebellion, which I don't know how big that is in the US, but in Europe, it's unbelievably impactful. So you can do a lot by getting people to organize around single issues as well. And I think particularly now when so many people feel pushed out and unrepresented by the mainstream political process, there is a lot of energy out there that people would like to see things change, and therefore these kinds of social movements are becoming very powerful. So there are some other ways, and I wouldn't put any faith in, you know, Congress being able to do anything, frankly. I mean, it's remarkable to me.
This, you know, I'm hoping this really fucking turbulent 4 years that the United States has had, and it seems like maybe the world has had, will inspire people to like keep moving past or stay activated beyond the fucking national election we're about to have. With either win, right? Because even if I think we've touched on this before, but even if Joe Biden gets into office, like I'm not expecting big things from the man. I'm hoping that he doesn't tweet constantly from his fucking phone.
Sure. I mean, that's kind of that's his platform, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He's like, I'm not gonna tweet, and I will like make marginally better choices for COVID that would result in like
on foreign policy points, like just appearing more stable is a very useful thing.
Yeah, just not being a lunatic.
But I think domestically, I wouldn't hold out much hope. I mean, so my two other things that radicalize people are very much like big issues that I don't think Joe Biden has no framework for, basically. So the debt, work, and housing, right? Like, I mean, debt is particularly bad in the US, obviously, because of the price of college. And, well, I mean, there's millions of statistics, but millennials have 300% more student debt than their parents. They're half as likely to own a house. They had to work 4,459 hours to pay for college versus 306 hours that their parents had to work. So, like, this is a insanely broken system. So instead of being launched into the work world with a great degree and a lot of opportunities, it's like, here's a bunch of debt that you'll never be able to manage, and then you build on that healthcare costs. Any kind of healthcare emergency, your credit rating's actually gone forever. And it's very hard to recover from a negative beginning in terms of like building wealth and being comfortable and having good quality of life, right? So this is a huge, huge problem. And then connected to that are the quality of work that is available. So, there's no wage increases since the 80s, the early 80s, essentially, in terms of real terms, like how far your dollar goes. So people have been doing a lot of work for a long time, getting poorer in real terms, which is nuts. And the worst part about that is that all the housing has been filling up that is even near to where they're working. So you're going further and further away and adding more and more cost in terms of getting to and from work because there's not enough housing. So we had a whole episode on this, on the housing issue, and actually the differences between the US and the UK. In the US, it's mostly a zoning issue. In the UK, it's basically we just haven't built any houses for like 100 years. Which, whoops.
Yeah.
No, actually, not. It's the same symptom, which is the people who own the current housing stock are the people who are very valuable in terms of political influence, and because they can pay for campaigns, or just because they vote in massive numbers in the UK and very predictably. So if you can court those people, then you can keep winning elections. You can keep winning power. And so courting the other people, why do it? Why bother? So that's a huge, huge problem. And staying engaged in electoral politics, I don't think is going to give young voters a lot of hope on any of those issues. Yeah.
I think it's wild how absent housing, specifically housing, is from, discourse on the national political level, because of how seemingly kind of ubiquitous of a problem it is, right? I know that you were just talking about, city politics, and I think that's definitely discourse that we hear like from mayors and things like that. But housing prices haven't stopped going up, and we've already discussed how wages have. And that's a basic issue, right? That's a basic fundamental problem in our system that just goes untalked about.
Yeah, I mean, it's still very short-term thinking, right? Because So if I'm a property developer, at a certain point, I run out of boomers to sell houses to. Like we're getting there, right? Like some,
to that point for sure.
My parents are retired. I think most boomers are retired now. I think as like a majority actually of them are retired. So they're not accumulating much more wealth. They're probably going to be moving it around and using it for different things. So all those massive, suburban 4-bedroom houses for their families or whatever, actually it's a big issue at the moment in suburbs in the States. I know that those like boomer dream houses that they had with their families, they now can't sell because they have these $2 million houses out in the suburbs. They're too big, they're too far away from work, no one can buy them. So they're just stuck with these huge empty houses. So that that is not a system that is going to work for like housing as a market going forwards, right? That doesn't make any sense. But in the short term, the profits remain there, right? So, and this is sort of the disease of also like, well, we'll get a load of people into work, right? We'll get them in unstable work. We'll make it really easy for employers to hire and fire people. They don't have to give them any benefits. Let's just get as many people into work as possible. But then we won't really pay them anything. And, they have to spend most of their money on rent and then the next amount of it on transport to and from work. And then it's like, well, okay, but who's buying all the stuff that you're producing? Like who's buying all those coffees? Who's buying the scooters or whatever it is? Like who is left to purchase the things that all of this labor is going into producing? Like there's still enough of them, I guess now, but that's going to run out. Right. Right.
You can't just accumulate all the wealth and then like pursue all this rent seeking behavior, assuming there's going to be
who's going to buy it?
A market. Yeah.
Who's going to buy it? Ultimately, I mean, this is the big issue of like supply side, trickle down economics. It's like, well, eventually everybody else runs out of money. So you stop being able to sell things to them. Like this is such an obvious closed loop of a problem. But it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, this is the big shocking thing, right? The amount of wealth, generational wealth, is like this enormous thing. There was a study on it in the US. I know. So once millennials will hit an average age of 35 in about 3 years, and in those 3 years, they need to triple the average wealth to hit where Generation X were in terms of share of overall wealth in the country. And they would have to times it by 7 to hit where boomers were when they were all 35 on average. But that isn't really how wealth accumulation tends to work. It tends to be you start from a certain point and that pretty much dictates how much you grow from there. So
yeah, it's pretty linear.
You have people start low with a bunch of debt who haven't been able to grow at all because the job market's been horrible and wages have stayed low. What's the plan for when all the boomers retire or age out of making any more money? They sell off their properties or they just let them be abandoned. They're in retirement home. What's the plan? Like, how does that economy work? And it's sort of amazing that we don't talk about any of this. Like, what's the long-term plan for how this economy could possibly work is never discussed, let alone if you take the like ecological collapse, and climate, where you go, well, if we keep growing by 50% every year, then that can't possibly work because in 10 years, the curve is some enormous amount of production that needs to happen where there's finite resources on the earth, like we just keep burning more and more fuel and more, to try and stay growing. We're not hearing any of that in this election, right? And we don't hear any of that in the UK elections, really, or it's dismissed.
You don't hear it anywhere.
It's dismissed as being like crank talk, where it's like, well, we actually can't keep doing this thing. Even if we accept that this is the best it's ever going to be, it still isn't sustainable, you know? So what's the plan?
Mm-hmm.
What's the plan there? Joe Biden? And he's like, well, you know, I won't tweet. Yeah, it's very frustrating.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's facts.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, it's all hopeless, but no, get activated on a local level, man.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, my message is like, who wouldn't be radicalized by this set of material circumstances? So that's the first thing. So if people come at you and they're like, oh, you've been spending too much time on YouTube or whatever, you know, you've been led astray, capitalism is the best system, etc., etc., there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the status quo isn't good. You know, it can be improved upon, as we said at the start, right? Like there's a lot of evidence there, and that, you know, you can reel off any of those kind of like 4 areas, right? Like just pick one that will resonate with the person you're speaking to, you know. And there's a lot of actually support for all these things as well. You know, issue by issue. It's just when we bundle these things together, they become scary and dangerous. But I ask people to think, why is it that they are seen as scary and dangerous? It's because they threaten power.
Yeah, and I also think that when people hear the word radical, right, they think, you know, these people want a violent revolution, right? And like that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, you know, with respect to, you know, again, this police conversation that's been going on about how like the state has this monopoly on violence, right? And, you know, that is a main weapon to, you know, that basically like, you know, this one side can use and the other side cannot. Right. And that's like a huge, again, it's very similar to what's, you know, it kind of mirrors what's going on in Congress with Republicans can throw out your Supreme Court justice and not hear them. And, you know, Democrats can't. Right. If one side can use these tools of power. Right. And like, you know, the rules of the game are fundamentally different. How does one, if you're committed to like, oh, like when they go low, we go high, but going high is not as effective, is just, you know, blatantly not.
Going low works all the time.
Every time, right?
And we
what do you do about that?
We also see this in the, you know, like culture wars stuff, right? There was this whole thing where it's like, you remember the rise of the intellectual dark web? They seem to have died down a little bit recently. But that was a big thing, you know, early Trump times, right? Like there's these new intellectuals and they're coming about and they're very popular. And they've all kind of like died off for various reasons. But one of the most effective ways of dealing with those people is just stop inviting them to speak at events. They get paid to do events. I mean, they get paid to do columns and speak at events. And if you just stop inviting them, they run out of money and they stop doing it. You know, no platforming, which a lot of people were like, oh, well, so much for the tolerant left, etc. You know, it's like, well, because it's effective. It's actually a really effective way of doing this. And we don't need to hear, you know, people spouting hate and saying, oh, this is free speech, because we've had all these arguments. We don't need to debate everything, you know? And I think there is this trap that people fall into where it's like, well, we need to, you know, talk through every idea and have a discussion and we win the argument. But our opponents do not act this way. And also there are some arguments you don't need to win. You've won. The argument's been won, you know, and the other side pretending to argue, you know, some abhorrent point of view, they're not doing it to win the argument. They're doing it for other reasons. They're doing it for attention. They're doing it for power, for distraction, whatever it is. They're not there as like real debaters. That is not the intention. I think it's also the thing that the press get wrong about populist leaders is that they think that they're like, oh, wow, this guy is acting really weirdly for a politician. And you're like, well, he's not. he's not a politician. Like, he's not doing the job that you think he's doing. And if you frame everything in that, like, well, he should be acting more like XYZ, that's not what's going on, you know? So I think one of the things for like younger people looking to be into politics is to stop taking so much of things at face value, and to just call out bad actors, because some of them are just in it for the wrong reasons and they're doing the wrong things, you know, and they're not. They're probably. I mean, maybe they're ideologically committed to whatever it is they're spouting, but I think a lot of the time they're just in it for money and attention, and that's okay to just dismiss people. I think, you know. I think we get distracted a lot of the time by those sort of constructed arguments, and we get pulled into having the arguments on the terms of our opponents, rather than saying, okay, I don't care about who's in the toilet, you know, the planet is dying. You know, what are we even arguing about? Like, this is on the scale of problems, this is a low one, you know, like, this is nothing. Let's talk about the real things that will impact the most people.
Rowan, thanks so much for sitting with us today. Really enjoyed your perspective. My question to you is, how are things in Brussels with COVID? Are y'all like kicking it? Are you good?
We've been a bit weird. Belgium doesn't get reported on a lot in the international news because it's a small, weird country. It's strange in Belgium because they count basically any possible death that might be COVID related as COVID related. So like any death in a care home, anything, it's just
so like the opposite.
Yeah,
of the US.
Belgium overcounts because they're like, it's better to overcount than to undercount, right? So it was seen as not doing very well for a while, but it's basically been fine. One of the issues that we have is that Brussels is like a 2-hour train ride from Paris, Amsterdam, and London. It's like 4 hours on the train to Germany. Like, it's incredibly connected. So, which is one of the reasons a lot of people move to Brussels, actually, because it's really in the heart of like Western Europe, and you can just move all around. But that is obviously an issue in pandemic times. But yes, on global levels, we're doing pretty well.
Do you want to take a second and just plug your show and any like social media platforms associated with it? Yeah,
sure. So it's Connection Disaffected or at C&D podcast. So we're on everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, whatever you want. Mostly Twitter, and also we have a subreddit as well. We're on all the podcast platforms that you want to get it, but it's about the future of politics, right? We try not to talk about horse race or what's going on in the elections. It's more like, well, what are the ideas that are going to move things forwards? You know, who are the people that are trying new things that are at least have a chance of making an impact? You know, so please check it out if you're interested. It's UK, 80% UK focus, I'd say. I have the view from Brussels, so there's a bit of an EU angle there, but a lot of it is applicable to US listeners as well. Actually, most of our listeners are in the US. So check it out if you want to get some big ideas to argue with your parents about, you know.
If you liked this episode, if you like Rowan, if you hate Rowan or us, let us know at I'm the Villain Pod. That's our Twitter. That's our Gmail. And that is our Instagram. Otherwise, bye.